More now about the situation in Venezuela with Diego Moya-Ocampos, a senior Latin America analyst at IHS, and he joins us now from London. Good afternoon to you. First of all, what do you make of Juan Guaido's chances of actually seizing power? Because it does seem, for the moment, that Maduro has the military behind him.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Juan Guaidó has assumed the president as head of the National Assembly. According to the Venezuelan constitution, if there's a vacuum of power, then the head of the National Assembly needs to step in and assume as interim president. Now, the main obstacle for Guaidó to basically take control of government functions continues being the military. Now, I'm not surprised of the statement we saw yesterday from the High Military Command. We know as a fact that the High Military Command is part of the government. These are the top military commanders which Maduro has granted extraordinary powers. He's granted them the oil services, control of ports, control of imports, control over strategic sectors of the economy. And that high military command, those top military commanders, are the ones which, according to US reports, according to media reports, are the ones who are involved in drug trafficking, illegal mining, fuel smuggling, human trafficking, and they have little incentive to withdraw support from Maduro. So the key thing to watch is whether the mid-ranks, the rank and file, members of the armed forces would break the chain of command, withdraw support of Maduro, and align with the head of the National Assembly, the head of Venezuelan Congress, turned president according to the constitutional provision.
Now, let's assume that does happen and Venezuela does get a new leader. What happens then? Because we know inflation is almost off the charts in Venezuela. Would a new leader hypothetically be able to do things to improve the economy and the lives for ordinary people?
Well, basically, the cause of this situation has been 20 years, first with Chavez, then with Maduro, of widespread corruption and epic mismanagement. Very tight foreign controls and price controls have led to these distortions, which have led to this hyperinflation, which have contributed to contract the economy and which has put Venezuela where it is. Also, of course, sanctions and the dramatic fall in oil production in Venezuela as a result of corruption and mismanagement. So a change of government which opens and paves the way for sanctions being lifted, for Venezuela's debt to be restructured, to create the conditions to attract foreign direct investment, and basically to change the direction of the economy towards a more pro-market sort of approach instead of the sort of nationalist government intervention approach, expropriation mode that Chavez and Maduro had in the past, will certainly be the first steps towards that needed economic oxygen which Venezuelans desperately need and which the one they're calling for protests in the streets.
Now, what do you make of the US response to all of this? We know, obviously, intervention is a very loaded word in the context of Venezuela, but there are some suggestions that by even just backing Guaido, the US has effectively intervened in the country. How significant do you think Washington's role is in Venezuela at the moment?
Well, I think it is not being framed correctly. Basically, what the U.S. has done is recognize the administration of Juan Guaidó, basically the same as Canada has done. Other EU countries have followed suit. The UK, for example, most Latin American countries have also recognized. And the reason why they have done so is because basically their interpretation is that the only democratically elected institution in Venezuela is the National Assembly, Venezuela's Congress. Because President Nicolas Maduro election in 20 May last year was basically conducted through a fraud, which was deemed as such by the EU, by the Organization of American States, and by other observers of that election. So in the absence of a legitimate president to inaugurate the mandate from 10th of January, the interpretation is that there's a vacuum of power. The Constitution of Venezuela, approved by President Chavez, by the way, basically establishes in Article 233 that it is the head of the National Assembly which needs to temporarily assume the presidency and call for elections. So I think the call from the US, from the EU, from most Latin American countries is for elections to take place in Venezuela with international observers so that the constitutional and democratic order can be restored in Venezuela, and that these ruling military elites that accompany Maduro in power step down, and so that Venezuelans can decide on their own fate. So I think the role of the U.S. in summary goes pretty much in line with other regional forces in the region, like, for example, Brazil, which has acted as a counterforce for the U.S. tradition in the region. So I think it's not a U.S. Venezuela thing. I think it's more an issue of democracy, freedom, rule of law, and an issue indeed of human rights violations in ongoing protests and in previous years by Venezuelans, and being repressed by the same military which controls the economy. That's the same military which is violating human rights and controlling protests from escalating in Caracas and nationwide.